I found the for sale sign stabbed into my lawn on a Tuesday morning. My children listed our family home behind my back, certain my grief made me easy to override. The offer was accepted, the movers scheduled, and I was treated like an obstacle. Then a stranger called about a letter my husband left before he died. That letter didn't just stop the sale. It exposed the real villain hiding in my own family and proved that the dead still protect the living. My name is Helen, and this is the story of how my late husband's final words saved everything. I had been a widow for 14 months when my lawn bloomed with betrayal. My 3 children, the ones who once filled this house with noise, decided I no longer deserved a say. To them, I was an aging woman lost in grief, a problem to manage, not a mother to protect. The papers were signed. The date circled. Then the phone rang. A stranger called about a letter my husband had written years before for this exact moment. Inside it was the truth about who really wanted me out of my home, and it wasn't my children. My husband Arthur had been dead for 14 months, but his voice was still in every room. The kitchen with the drawer that stuck exactly the way he never got around to fixing. The workshop in the basement, tools hung on pegboard, each one outlined in black marker. The swing on the back porch, the one he built the summer our youngest graduated college, and the big maple in the front yard, the tree that dropped leaves he complained about every autumn for 38 years. I could hear him. But the children couldn't. Or wouldn't. It started 6 months after the funeral. A quiet erosion I didn't notice at first because grief makes you blind to everything except the absence. Claire, my eldest, began calling more often. At first, I took it as kindness. She'd ask how I was sleeping, whether I'd eaten, whether I'd remembered to pay the electric bill. Her voice gentle, concerned. I'd say I was managing, and she'd say, "I know, Mom, I just worry." I should have heard the edge in that word. Worry. It wasn't comfort. It was diagnosis. Then the visits began. Claire and her husband, Mark, would come for Sunday dinner. Mark was the one who married into our family 3 years earlier, a man with perfect teeth and a handshake that always felt like he was measuring your grip. He worked in finance, though no one could quite say what he financed. He'd walk through our house with the careful steps of an appraiser. I'd catch him looking at the crown molding, the hardwood floors, the original stained glass in the front door, Arthur's grandmother's design, and his eyes would flicker with something I now recognize as calculation. But back then, I just thought he liked old houses. One Sunday, Claire cornered me in the kitchen while Mark and my son, David, were in the living room. "Mom, this house is a lot for one person," she said, stirring a pot of gravy. The stairs. The yard. The taxes. Her voice was the same one I used on patients when I was still a nurse, the voice you use to prepare someone for difficult news. I told her I'd been managing this house for decades. She nodded. "But Dad was here then." "Now, it's just you." The words landed like a judgment. A month later, my youngest, Sarah, came to visit from out of state. She and Claire spent an afternoon in the backyard, heads bent together, talking in low tones. When they came inside, their faces were arranged in that careful expression children wear when they're about to have an intervention. They brought up the idea of downsizing, a smaller place, a condo maybe, something with no maintenance. Sarah said, "We just want you to be safe." The same word Claire used. Safe. I told them I felt perfectly safe in the home where I'd lived since 1985. Claire said, "That's exactly the point. You've been here so long you can't see the risks." The pressure grew like a slow leak. My son David, who used to call every week, started calling twice a day with helpful suggestions. His voice had the rehearsed quality of someone reading from a script. He mentioned a retirement community on the edge of town, the kind with manicured lawns and smiling residents who looked like they'd been hollowed out and stuffed with pleasantries. "It's independent living," he said, but with support nearby in case you need it. I told him I didn't need support. He said, "You might not know what you need right now." I felt something shift in my own kitchen. They weren't asking anymore. They were deciding. And then I found out who was really behind it. It was a Thursday, Arthur's birthday. The first one I'd faced without him. I'd spent the morning in the garden, pulling weeds the way he used to, my hands aching and my mind quiet. I came inside for a glass of water and saw a car parked across the street. Mark's silver Audi. He was sitting behind the wheel, phone pressed to his ear, not looking at the house. Something about it felt wrong, so I watched. He was talking animatedly, gesturing, and then he glanced at my house, not at me, but at the property itself, and nodded. A realtor's sign wasn't in the yard yet, but the idea of one was already there, planted in his mind like a stake. I asked David about Mark that evening. "What does Mark actually do?" David hesitated. "He's an entrepreneur, does a lot of different things." The vague answer prickled. "He's been talking to Claire about your situation," David added, as if that were a natural thing. "He thinks we need to be proactive." The word proactive sounded like a business term, as if I were a failing asset. The following Monday, I came home from the grocery store and found a realtor parked in my driveway. She was a poised woman in her 40s with a clipboard and a practiced smile. She introduced herself and said my daughter's husband had scheduled a market valuation. I told her there must be a mistake. She checked her notes. Mark Benson. He said he had family authority. I didn't know what that phrase meant, but the chill in my blood told me everything. I sent her away and then stood in my front hall, shaking. My son-in-law was assessing my home without my permission. The children I had raised, the ones whose artwork still hung on the refrigerator, were talking about my house as if I no longer lived there. And then, a week later, the sign appeared. I walked outside on a Tuesday morning to get the paper, and there it was, hammered into the grass near the mailbox like a declaration of war. For sale. It had a picture of my house, my front porch, my stained glass window, all under the logo of a local agency. Beneath the photo, the words "motivated seller." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood on the lawn in my robe and looked at the thing that announced my children had decided my life was an inconvenience. The morning was quiet, the way a hospital room is quiet right before a code blue. I knew then that I had an enemy. I just didn't know which of my children had been turned. That afternoon, I called Claire. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright with forced cheer. I asked her about the sign. There was a pause, the kind where you can hear someone arranging their face over the phone. "Mom, we've been talking about this. The house is too much for you now. David and Sarah and I all agree." I asked her who we was. She said, "All of us. We love you, and this is the best thing." I asked her if she'd ever considered the best thing might involve asking me what I wanted. Another pause. Sometimes you don't know what's best for you. The phrase sounded like something Mark would say. I hung up and sat in the kitchen for a long time, with Arthur's empty chair across from me and the smell of coffee going cold. 43 years of marriage compressed into the ache behind my ribs. I had believed, naively, that grief would bring us closer, that losing their father would remind my children that family was the only permanent thing. Instead, it had turned them into strangers with legal power of attorney I hadn't given them. I felt the ground shifting beneath me, everything I'd built being dismantled by people who called it love. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked through the house room by room, touching the walls, the photographs, the memory of Arthur's laughter in the hallway. I stood in his workshop and looked at his tools, each one positioned exactly where he'd left it. And then I heard it, the creak of the front porch step, the one Arthur always meant to fix. My heart hammered. Someone was outside. I crept to the window and saw a figure walking away into the dark. Not a child. A man in a dark jacket. I didn't recognize him, but I recognized the posture of someone comfortable in the dark. Whoever put the sign in my yard was still watching. The next day, the offer arrived. Not a suggestion, not a conversation, a signed purchase agreement. My daughter Claire had accepted an offer on a house she didn't own, using a legal document I'd never signed. I held the paper in my hands and felt the floor drop out. The buyers were listed as a development company that specialized in demolishing old houses for modern builds. My home, Arthur's home, would be rubble. And my children were listed as the sellers. My daughter's husband, Mark, had his name right there on the signature line as a witness. I put the paper down and called an attorney. But then the phone rang again. Not my lawyer, a stranger. Mrs. Benson, the voice said, male. Gravelly. You don't know me, but I knew your husband. I have something he gave me years ago. A letter. He told me to deliver it if things ever went a certain way. The man hesitated, as if weighing how much to say. He knew something was wrong in your family before he died. Something about your daughter's husband. The air in my kitchen went still. I'll be at the diner on Maple Street in 1 hour, he said. Bring the letter, I said. I am the letter, he answered, and hung up. Arthur had prepared. Even from the grave, he was still trying to save me. The diner on Maple Street was a relic from another era, cracked vinyl booths, a jukebox that hadn't worked since the 90s, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. I arrived 10 minutes early and took a corner booth where I could see the door. The place was empty except for a cook scraping the grill and a waitress who refilled my cup without asking. My hands were shaking, not from the caffeine, but from the feeling that my entire life had just become a mystery where I didn't know the villain. A man walked in at exactly the hour mark. He was older, maybe 70, with a limp and a face worn by years of weather. He wore a canvas jacket and carried nothing but a worn leather folder. He scanned the room, spotted me, and walked over with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who had carried a secret for a very long time. When he slid into the booth across from me, I saw his eyes were the same shade of gray as Arthur's had been in those last years. Kind, tired, Mrs. Benson. I'm Walter Ellis. I worked with your husband for 20 years at the plant before I retired. I didn't recognize him. Arthur had been a quiet man who kept his work life separate from home. Walter placed the leather folder on the table between us. Arthur came to me about 3 years ago. Asked me to hold on to something. Told me if anything ever happened to him, I was to wait until certain signs appeared. The sign in your yard was the one he described. He tapped the folder. He said whoever was behind the sale would be the real danger. And he knew who it would be. I opened the folder with fingers that felt like ice. Inside was a sealed envelope with my name written in Arthur's careful block letters, and beneath it, a stack of documents that I didn't recognize. I pulled out the letter first. The paper smelled faintly of his workshop, the sawdust and varnish that had embedded itself into everything he touched. I unfolded it and began to read. Dear Helen, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And if this letter has reached you, then our daughter Claire is in more trouble than she can say. I need you to understand something before you read any further. Claire is not your enemy. She is a hostage. I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked up at Walter. He nodded, his expression grim. I went back to the letter. I've spent the last 2 years watching something I couldn't prove until recently. Mark Benson is not just a poor match for our daughter. He is a predator. He married Claire not because he loved her, but because he needed access to our family assets. I didn't discover this until I noticed irregularities in the accounts I'd set up for the children's inheritance. Small withdrawals at first, then larger ones, all linked to Mark's business dealings. When I confronted Claire, she broke down and told me the truth. She's been trapped in a nightmare, Helen, and she's too terrified to leave. I paused, my throat tightening. Claire, my firstborn, The girl who used to follow Arthur around the workshop, holding his tools and asking a million questions. She had always been so strong, so independent. The idea that she was trapped made something snap inside me. Arthur's letter continued. Mark has full control over her. He took out credit cards in her name, ran up debts she didn't know about, and then used those debts to threaten her with legal ruin. He's told her that if she ever leaves him, he'll report her for fraud, crimes she didn't commit, but he's made it look like she did. He's isolated her from us by feeding her a constant stream of lies, that we're too old to handle the truth, that we'd blame her, that we'd lose the house if she didn't cooperate. He's been working on our children for years, positioning himself as the rational, concerned son-in-law while poisoning them against their own mother. I had to put the letter down for a moment because my vision was tunneling. The waitress glanced over, and Walter held up a hand to keep her away. I took a breath, forced myself to keep reading. 3 months ago, I confronted Mark directly. I told him I knew about the debts and the forgery. I gave him a chance to walk away quietly, to leave Claire alone, and I would not involve the police. He laughed at me, Helen. He said he had plans for our house and our family, and that any attempt to stop him would end with Claire in prison. He said the children already believed I was senile, that they were ready to have me declared incompetent. He had all the pieces in place. I realized then that I couldn't stop him with confrontation. I had to build a case that would free our daughter, even if I wasn't here to see it. The letter near the end was shakier, as if his hand had tired. Inside this envelope, you'll find everything I've gathered. Bank statements showing Mark's shell accounts, the forged credit card applications, recordings of conversations Claire made for me in which Mark threatens her, and, most importantly, the name of a forensic accountant who can prove that Mark has been embezzling from his own supposed business for years. I also left a copy of my will, the real one, with our attorney James Holloway. It specifies that you retain full ownership of the house regardless of any later documents. Any sale made without your signature is fraudulent. Use this, Helen. Protect our daughter. Protect our home. I love you. I'm still protecting you. Arthur. I looked at Walter, who had been sitting in respectful silence the whole time. You knew all this? I whispered. I knew Arthur was gathering evidence, Walter said. He was a meticulous man. He'd come to the diner every week for a cup of coffee and update me. I think he needed one person who believed him. After he died, I waited. When I saw that sign go up in your yard, I knew the plan was in motion. I sifted through the documents beneath the letter. The bank statements were a mess of red flags, transfers to accounts I'd never heard of, credit cards with Claire's signature but purchases she never could have made, letters from collection agencies. There were printouts of text messages between Mark and an unknown number, discussing how to accelerate the timeline and secure the capital from the old house. The language was cold, transactional. My home was an asset to be liquidated. And then there was the small recording device at the bottom of the folder. A digital recorder with a label in Arthur's handwriting, Mark's threats, Oct 4. My hands trembled as I pressed play. The sound was tinny, but clear. Mark's voice, oily and calm, filled the diner booth. I don't care what you're comfortable with, Claire. You signed the papers. You're already legally liable. If you don't help me sell that house, I'll make sure the police know it was you who forged those accounts. I've got everything to bury you. Now go call your mother and start the groundwork. She trusts you. Use that. Claire's voice answered, small and broken. She's my mother. I can't just. You can, and you will, or you'll be having this conversation from a jail cell. Your choice. The recording clicked off. I was shaking so badly that the table rattled. My daughter wasn't a traitor. She was a victim, a prisoner in her own marriage, beaten down by a man who had systematically dismantled her confidence and turned her into a weapon against her own family. And I had seen her as the enemy. The guilt hit me harder than any of Mark's schemes. Walter pushed his coffee aside. There's more. The forensic accountant Arthur hired, her name is Diana Cole. She's been tracking Mark's money for months. She found something bigger. He's not just trying to get your house. He's into a private investment firm that's been buying up properties in your neighborhood, flipping them to developers. Your house is the last one they need for a big parcel consolidation. The timelines align perfectly. So this isn't just about money. It's about my entire neighborhood. It's about greed, plain and simple. But the good news is, Diana has enough to get a criminal investigation opened. The recording alone is extortion. Combine that with the forged documents, and Mark's financial empire collapses. I closed the folder, my mind racing. Arthur had given me a sword and a shield, but I had no armor. I had to act before the sale closed in 2 weeks. But I also had to reach Claire without Mark finding out. If he sensed a threat, he might destroy evidence, or, worse, hurt her. I looked at Walter. Why now? Why wait until the sign was in the yard? Because Arthur knew that if I gave this to you too soon, you might not believe it. You'd think it was a desperate widow's conspiracy. He wanted you to see the sign with your own eyes, to feel the betrayal firsthand. So you'd know the scale of what you were dealing with. Now you're ready. He was right. The sign had been the necessary wound that opened my eyes. Without it, I might have dismissed this folder as the ravings of a dying man who never liked his son-in-law. Now I understood that my husband had been a quiet genius, setting a trap from beyond the grave, and I was the trigger. I phoned Diana Cole from the diner. She answered on the first ring, her voice all business. Mrs. Benson, I've been expecting your call. Your husband was a good man. I've got warrants ready to file against Mark Benson for wire fraud, identity theft, and extortion. All I need is Claire to come forward as a cooperating witness. Do you think she'll do it? I thought about my daughter, the one who had brought a for sale sign to my lawn but had cried in my kitchen when she thought I wasn't looking. She wasn't a villain. She was a hostage. And I was about to give her the key. I'll make her do it, I said. I just need to get her alone. Diana paused. Be careful. Men like Mark don't go down without a fight, and he's been one step ahead of your family for years. He'll know something's changed. The call ended, and Walter stood to leave. There's one last thing Arthur wanted me to tell you, he said, hand on my shoulder. The house has a secret room. You remember the old root cellar that got walled up during the renovation in '92? Arthur stored some of his most important documents there, things he didn't want anyone finding. I think you'll want to look. I grabbed his arm. Why didn't he just tell me this when he was alive? He was afraid you'd confront Mark too soon. He needed everything in place. Now it is. He gave my shoulder a final squeeze and walked out into the afternoon sun. I paid for the coffee and drove home with the folder on the passenger seat like a bomb. The for sale sign was still in the yard, but now it looked different, less like a defeat and more like a battle flag. I pulled into the driveway and saw a light on in the kitchen. Someone was inside. My son David's car sat at the curb. He wasn't supposed to be here, but when I walked through the back door, I found him sitting at the kitchen table, his face pale as ash, a manila envelope identical to the one I'd just left at the diner sitting in front of him. His eyes were wet. Mom, he said, I think I've been an idiot. Dad sent me a letter too. It just arrived. He pushed the envelope toward me. He told me everything. About Mark. About Claire. About the debt I didn't even know I had. I'm so sorry. I crossed the room and pulled my son into my arms. He smelled of the same sawdust that had always clung to Arthur's clothes. For the first time in months, the wall between us cracked. We're going to fix this, I said. But first, we need to find your sister before Mark realizes we have the truth. As if on cue, my phone buzzed. A text from Claire. Mom, he knows. Please help. and then the kitchen lights went out. The darkness was absolute. For a moment, I was back in the hospital during a power outage, the backup generators failing, the sound of ventilators going silent. That old nurse instinct kicked in. Don't panic, assess, act. I reached out in the black and found David's arm. He was frozen, his breathing fast and shallow. "Mom, what's happening?" His voice was the voice of the little boy who used to climb into our bed during thunderstorms. I squeezed his wrist. Someone cut the power. "Stay low." We crouched beside the kitchen island. Through the window above the sink, I could see the streetlight on the corner still glowing. This was targeted. Just our house. I pulled out my phone for light, but before I could activate it, a sound stopped me cold. The back door opening. Not the creak of an old hinge. This was quiet, deliberate. Someone who knew exactly where to step to avoid the squeaky floorboard by the pantry. A voice cut through the dark, calm and measured. The voice of a man who believed he controlled the board. "Helen, I know you have the folder. I know you've talked to Walter. I've been watching your house for 2 weeks. So let's not waste time." Mark, standing somewhere in my kitchen in the dark. David tensed beside me, but I put a hand on his chest to keep him still. Mark's footsteps moved slowly across the tile, each one a small exercise in intimidation. "You see, I've been very patient," Mark continued, his voice a little closer now. "I've spent 3 years positioning myself, cultivating your children's trust, managing the timeline. I wasn't planning on Arthur being so resourceful from the grave. But here we are." A pause. "You're holding evidence that could embarrass me. That's all it is. Embarrassment. I have lawyers. I have contingency plans. But I'd rather not use them. So I'm offering you a deal," David whispered. Don't listen to him. But I needed to hear what my enemy had to say. What deal? I kept my voice steady, that nurse's command tone I'd used on dying patients and arrogant surgeons alike. The folder. The recordings. Everything Arthur gathered. You hand it over, and I walk away. The sale goes through, you move to a comfortable retirement facility, and Claire doesn't go to prison. Because make no mistake, if I fall, I take her with me. I've made sure she's entangled in every layer of my business. Fraud, embezzlement, money laundering. She signed the papers, she made the transfers. The law won't care that she was coerced. She'll spend the next 20 years in a cell. His voice was silk over steel. I'd heard that tone before, in the IQ from a man who'd beaten his wife half to death and then blamed her for provoking him. It was the sound of a predator justifying everything. I thought of Claire's text, "Mom, he knows. Please help." She must have sent it the second she realized he was coming here. She was still trying to protect me, even while terrified for her own life. "You're lying," I said. "Claire didn't commit those crimes. The forensic accountant already traced the IP addresses, the signatures, the digital trail. It all leads to you." My husband made sure of that. A beat of silence. Then a low, humorless laugh. "Ah, the forensic accountant. Diana Cole. Yes, I've had my eye on her too. She's good, but she doesn't have everything. And she certainly doesn't have." He was interrupted by a crash from the front of the house. Glass shattering, then footsteps, rapid and desperate. Claire's voice, screaming, "Mom, he's here!" I couldn't stop him. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The lights flickered back on. Mark had flipped the breaker to reassert control, but the sudden brightness disoriented him for just a second. In that second, I saw him clearly, standing 10 feet away, a dark silhouette in an expensive coat, his face twisted with the same cold calculation I'd glimpsed at Sunday dinners. And behind him, in the hallway, Claire appeared. Her blouse was torn, her face bruised, and she was holding something heavy. the cast iron skillet from the stove. She swung it with all her strength. The skillet connected with the back of Mark's head with a sound that echoed through the kitchen. He staggered, dropped to one knee, but didn't go down. He turned, slow and enraged, and backhanded Claire across the face. She flew into the wall and crumpled. David lunged at Mark, but I was already moving, grabbing the pepper spray I kept in my purse on the counter. I had one shot, and I took it, spraying directly into Mark's eyes. He screamed, clawing at his face, stumbling backward into the table. David tackled him to the floor, pinning his arms. "Call 911, Mom." I was already dialing. My hands were shaking, but the operator's voice was calm, and I gave the address clearly, the way I'd done 1,000 times as a nurse calling codes. Send police and an ambulance. Home invasion. Assault. My daughter is injured. Mark was thrashing, half-blind, spitting threats. "You stupid old woman. You have no idea what you've done." The people I work with, they don't tolerate loose ends. This isn't just about a house. It's about millions. You've just started a war you can't win. I knelt beside Claire, who was conscious but dazed, blood trickling from her lip. "It's okay," I whispered. "It's over. He can't hurt you anymore." She gripped my hand so hard I felt bones grind. "Mom, he wasn't working alone. There are others. Developers, investors, people who've been buying properties in the neighborhood. They're meeting tonight at the old paper mill. They're going to push the sale through regardless. They have a judge in their pocket, the title company is compromised, and they've already got demolition permits pending. Mark was just the front. If they find out he's been compromised, they'll move faster." I felt a chill. The threat was bigger than one man. It was a network, a machine designed to strip seniors of their homes, and my family had stumbled into its gears. The police arrived within minutes. Mark was handcuffed, still shouting about his lawyers, his investors, his rights. Claire gave a preliminary statement through tears, describing the years of abuse, the forged documents, the threats. David stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder. The two of them finally reunited against the monster who had torn them apart. But as the paramedics checked Claire's injuries, a detective pulled me aside. His name was Harris, a man in his 50s with tired eyes and a demeanor that suggested he'd seen everything and was no longer surprised by any of it. "Mrs. Benson, your daughter mentioned a meeting at the old paper mill. Did she give you any specifics?" "Just that it was tonight." "Investors and developers." Detective Harris nodded slowly. "We've been investigating a ring of these guys for 6 months. Predatory real estate fraud targeting elderly homeowners. They use family members as proxies, spouses, children, caretakers, to pressure seniors into selling. Mark Benson fits the profile exactly. If we can catch the meeting, we could roll up the whole operation." He paused. "But we'd need someone on the inside. Someone they'd recognize as part of their world." And then I understood. Mark was the inside man they knew, and if he failed to show, they'd scatter. But if someone else arrived in his place, someone they thought was still on their side, "Use me," I said. Harris blinked. "Excuse me? I'm supposed to be the confused old woman, the one being managed. If I show up at that meeting, acting as if my son-in-law sent me, they'll believe it. They'll underestimate me. Give me a wire. I'll get them to incriminate themselves." David overheard and rushed over. "Absolutely not. Mom, this is insane. These are dangerous people. These dangerous people are trying to destroy our home, our family, and the neighborhood your father and I built our lives in. I've been a widow for 14 months, and in that time I've let grief make me small. No more. Your father prepared for this. I'm finishing what he started." Claire, despite her injuries, raised her head from the stretcher. Mom's right. Mark used to brag about the paper mill meetings. They're arrogant. They think they're untouchable. If they see an old woman who seems confused and compliant, they'll spill everything to her. It's the smart play. Harris steadied me for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small recording device. This is a tactical transmitter. It'll broadcast directly to our van. Keep it in your pocket. We'll be close, but if anything goes wrong, we'll move in. He looked at me with something like respect. Your husband was a smart man, Mrs. Benson. It seems he married one, too. As the paramedics loaded Claire into the ambulance and David accompanied her, I stood in my kitchen, my home, surrounded by broken glass and scattered memories. The for sale sign was still in the front yard, a monument to everything that had nearly been taken. But now it was a prop in a larger play, and I was stepping onto the stage Arthur had built for me. I walked to the basement, to the wall where the old root cellar had been sealed in 1992. Walter had told me Arthur hid something there. I found a sledgehammer in Arthur's workshop, the one he'd taught David how to use. One swing, then another, and the drywall crumbled. Behind it was a small, dark cavity, and inside it, a metal lockbox. I pulled it out, opened it with the key from Arthur's letter. Inside were photographs. News clippings. A list of names and shell companies, all connected to the same real estate fraud ring. Arthur had been building a case against them too, not just against Mark. He knew the whole scope. He'd been connecting the dots for years, and his file included the names of city officials on the take, appraisers who inflated values, and title company employees who forged signatures. This was evidence that could bring down a criminal enterprise. And at the bottom of the box was a final note in Arthur's handwriting. Helen, if you're reading this, you've already faced Mark and won. But the war isn't over. Take this list to the paper mill tonight. I've been watching them for 3 years. The meeting happens on the 3rd Thursday of every month at midnight. They think the old mill is safe. Show them it's not. I love you. Finish it. I checked the date. Tonight was the 3rd Thursday. I went upstairs, changed into my clothes, not armor, but the kind of simple dress a confused grandmother might wear. I tucked the recording device into my pocket. I called Detective Harris and told him about the lockbox. His voice tightened with excitement. We'll have tactical units in place. If you can get them to talk about the development plans, the fraud, the bribes, we'll have everything we need. I drove to the old paper mill alone, the roads dark and empty, the city sleeping. The mill was a hulking ruin of brick and rust, its windows shattered, its parking lot cracked. But as I pulled in, I saw a cluster of expensive cars, Mercedes, BMWs, an Audi just like Mark's. Men in suits stood near a side door, smoking, laughing. They saw my old sedan and frowned. I got out, playing the part, a little uncertain, a little lost. One of the men, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, approached. Ma'am, this is private property. I know, I said, letting my voice quaver. Mark Benson sent me. He couldn't come, family emergency. He said I should bring the final paperwork for the Benson property deal. I held up the manila envelope I'd prepared, filled with blank paper, but sealed with an official-looking stamp. The man relaxed, a smirk crossing his face. Helen Benson, I presume, the stubborn mother-in-law. Mark said you'd finally seen reason. Come inside. I followed him into the mill, my heart pounding, the recording device pressing against my hip. I was walking into the belly of the beast, but I wasn't alone. I had Arthur's evidence in my pocket, his name on my heart, and the weight of generations on my shoulders. The room was lit by bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling, wooden tables spread with maps and property deeds. 8 men sat around the table, all of them older, wealthy, comfortable. They looked at me with mild curiosity. The silver-haired man gestured to a seat. Gentlemen, this is Helen Benson. She's the last piece of the Oakwood development puzzle. With her property, we own the entire block. They smiled. They murmured approval. They had no idea they were minutes away from destruction. I took my seat at the table, my hands folded in my lap like the meek old woman they expected. The silver-haired man, whose name I learned was Carlton Reeves, spread blueprints across the table. They showed our neighborhood, every house, every lot, red X's marking the properties already acquired. Only one remained blank. My home. The final domino. Mrs. Benson, Carlton said, his voice dripping with condescending sympathy. We're so glad you came around. Your son-in-law, Mark, has been instrumental in this project. He told us you'd be the emotional one, the one who needed convincing. But he also said you'd eventually see reason. I tilted my head, playing confused. Mark has been so helpful. But I do have questions. What exactly will happen to my house once I sign? A balding man across the table, a city councilman I recognized from the local paper, leaned forward. The whole block's being rezoned. Mixed-use development. Retail on the bottom, luxury condos above. Your house sits on the prime corner lot. We've already got a hotel chain interested. Demolition scheduled for next month, pending the final signature. Demolition. They said it so casually, as if my home were not the vessel of 38 years of marriage, not the place where I'd raised 3 children, not the walls that had absorbed Arthur's last breath. I see, I said, my voice trembling just enough. And the money? Mark said I'd be taken care of. Carlton smiled. Of course. You'll receive fair market value, but more importantly, you'll have the peace of mind knowing you're not standing in the way of progress. He slid a document toward me. We just need this final easement agreement. It allows us to begin preliminary work before the formal closing. Standard procedure. I recognized the document. Arthur had a copy in his lockbox. It was a trap. Signing it gave them access to the property without transferring full ownership. A legal gray zone they'd exploit to force the sale. Once signed, they could start demolition while tying me up in court for years. My husband always told me never to sign anything without reading it, I said, picking up the paper. He was very protective. He'd be so worried about this meeting. Your husband isn't here anymore, the councilman said, blunt and careless. And frankly, Mrs. Benson, the clock is ticking. We have a lot of money riding on this. Your son-in-law promised us the property would be cleared by month's end. If you're going to be difficult— I'm not being difficult, I interrupted, keeping my voice soft. I just want to understand. All of you, working together, it must be worth a great deal. Mark mentioned investors, overseas accounts, some very clever financial arrangements. Is it true the title company can push the sale even without my consent? Carlton chuckled, shaking his head at the others as if to say she's simple. Let me explain how this works, dear. We have a judge who owes us a favor. We have an appraiser who values properties exactly where we need them. We have a title company that can, let's say, overlook certain irregularities. If you fight us, you'll lose. If you cooperate, you'll walk away with a check and a nice story for your grandchildren about how you helped build the future. So, which will it be? I let the silence stretch. Then I asked the question I needed on tape. And Mark? What does he get out of all this? The balding councilman snorted. Mark gets his debts cleared and a cut of the condo sales. He's been living beyond his means for years, keeping up appearances. The man owes $500,000 to some very unpleasant people. This development is his get-out-of-jail-free card. He's been planning it since before he married your daughter. There it was. The motive, the conspiracy, the admission of fraud, all spoken openly in a room full of men who thought I was just a confused grandmother they could intimidate. I felt the transmitter in my pocket, warm against my hip, and imagined Detective Harris in the van outside, listening to every word. I placed the document back on the table. I don't think I'll be signing this after all. Carlton's smile vanished. Excuse me? My husband Arthur spent the last 3 years of his life investigating men like you. He documented every bribe, every forged signature, every backroom deal. And tonight, I brought his evidence to the police. I stood, no longer the meek old woman. You asked which I'd choose, fight or cooperate. I choose to fight. And you're all under arrest. For a moment, the room was frozen, the men staring at me as if I'd spoken in tongues. Then Carlton laughed, a nervous bark. You're bluffing. You walked in here alone. I walked in here wired. I pulled the transmitter from my pocket, held it up for them to see. Every word you've said has been broadcast to a tactical police unit. They're outside right now. As if on cue, the mill's doors burst open, flashlights sliced through the dim room, and voices shouted commands. Detective Harris led the charge, officers swarming in from every entrance. The men scrambled, seizing documents, bolting for exits, but there was nowhere to go. Carlton Reeves tried to grab the blueprints, but I snatched them first. These belong to my family now, I said. The arrests were swift and chaotic. 8 men in handcuffs, including the councilman who was shouting about his attorney. Evidence bags filled with contracts, ledgers, and laptops. Harris approached me as the last of them was led away. Mrs. Benson, that was one of the bravest things I've ever seen a civilian do. We got them on conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery, racketeering. They're going away for a long time. Your husband's evidence fills in the gaps. We'll also be able to protect Claire. With the recording and the documents proving coercion, she's a victim, not a defendant. I felt tears I'd been holding back. What about Mark? Already in custody, and when we searched his car, we found additional evidence linking him to the money laundering operation. He's facing federal charges. He'll never hurt your daughter again. The next days were a blur of legal proceedings, phone calls, and the slow, careful work of rebuilding a shattered family. The for sale sign was removed from my yard on a sunny Wednesday morning, and I stood on the porch watching the realtor's assistant pry it from the ground as if uprooting a weed. Claire came home from the hospital, her bruises healing, her eyes still haunted but no longer hollow. She moved back into her childhood room while her marriage was annulled. Not just divorced, annulled. Because a union built on fraud is no union at all. David took a week off work to help. He fixed the broken back door and repaired the drywall where I'd smashed through to the root cellar. We didn't speak much during those days, but the silence was different now. Not the cold distance of suspicion, but the quiet comfort of shared purpose. He found Arthur's old toolbox and began reorganizing it, his movements so like his father's that I had to look away sometimes. And then came the morning Sarah arrived, my youngest, flown in from across the country. She stood on the porch, suitcase in hand, her face a map of guilt and relief. I didn't know, she said, voice breaking. Mark told me you were declining. He sent fake medical reports. I thought I was saving you. We held each other on the threshold of the home I'd almost lost, and I forgave her, because that's what mothers do. But the final surprise came a week later, when the family attorney, James Holloway, arrived with a thick envelope. We gathered in the living room, myself, Claire, David, Sarah, and he opened the packet with the solemnity of a ceremony. Arthur amended his will several times in his last year, James said. He didn't tell any of you because he wanted the changes to activate only after the exposure of the conspiracy. Now that Mark has been arrested and the real estate ring dismantled, the conditions are met. He handed me a letter in Arthur's handwriting, the last of the series he'd left scattered through trusted hands like breadcrumbs leading home. I read it aloud to my children. Dearest Helen, David, Claire, and Sarah. If you're all together reading this, then the nightmare is over. I am sorry I couldn't be there to see it. I want you to know that I never doubted any of you. I doubted only the predators who prey on grief and trust. I've spent my life building a home, not just of wood and nails, but of love. That home is now protected. The stock I purchased in 1994, a small tech company started by a patient I once treated, went public and has grown beyond anything I imagined. I've left those shares in a trust that ensures this house remains in our family forever. The trust covers all taxes, maintenance, and renovations. No one can ever force a sale. The house will pass to you, and then to your children, a legacy that cannot be stolen. Use the remaining funds to live well, to help others, and to remember that the strongest protection is love prepared for war. I am still with you. Dad, I unfolded the stock certificate attached to the letter. The value, James explained, was currently just over $1.2 million. The trust would secure the house permanently, with enough left over to establish a foundation dedicated to helping other seniors facing predatory fraud. Arthur had not just saved our home, he'd ensured I could save others. We sat in stunned silence, the weight of his foresight settling over us like a blessing. Claire wept openly. David put his arm around her. Sarah reached for my hand. The house felt, for the first time since Arthur's death, full again. Not just of people, but of his presence. The tools on the pegboard, the swing on the back porch, the stained glass window that caught the afternoon light. All of it anchored now, unassailable. That evening, I walked the property alone, tracing the path Arthur and I had walked 1,000 times. I stopped at the big maple, its leaves just beginning to turn for autumn. I remembered him here, complaining about the raking, his hands calloused, his eyes warm. He'd prepared for everything, even a war he wouldn't live to fight. But his strategy was love, his ammunition was truth, and his final victory was the family gathered in the house behind me, healing together. I touched the bark of the tree and whispered into the evening air, "We did it, Arthur. They're safe. We're all safe." The story of my family is not unique. Every year, thousands of aging parents find themselves facing a different kind of decline, not of body or mind, but of agency. Their homes, their savings, their dignity stripped away by people who weaponize love and trust. Predators don't always break through windows. Sometimes they walk through the front door, smiling, holding your daughter's hand. Mark Benson thought grief had made me weak. He was wrong. Grief had carved a hollow in my chest, but Arthur filled it with evidence, with letters, with a plan so thorough it spanned the grave. What looked like an old woman's helplessness was actually the quiet gathering of a storm. I think often about that morning the for sale sign appeared. How I stood on my lawn in my robe, the dew soaking through my slippers, and felt the world tilt. I didn't know then that the sign was an alarm clock, that Arthur had set it years before, trusting that when it finally rang, I would wake, that I would fight, that I would find the allies he'd hidden in plain sight, Walter at the diner, Diana with her spreadsheets, Detective Harris with his tired eyes who believed an old woman could be a hero. Claire still sleeps in her childhood room. Some nights she cries, and I go to her, the way I did when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms. But now the storms are memories, and we weather them together. David fixed the back door and then stayed to fix the porch swing, and then just stayed. Sarah calls every day, and her voice no longer carries the false cheer of a daughter performing concern. We are rebuilding, not just a house, but a family that had been quietly dismantled by a man who understood our fractures better than we did. There is a question that lingers, though, one I ask myself in the quiet moments when the house settles and the maple casts its shadow across the yard. How many other families are living inside a lie like ours was? How many aging parents are being managed instead of loved, their wishes reframed as symptoms, their resistance diagnosed as confusion? If you looked at your own family right now, would you see care or control? Would you recognize the difference before a sign appeared in your yard? Arthur prepared me for the war I didn't know was coming. But his greatest gift wasn't the stock, or the trust, or the locked room full of evidence. It was the reminder that I was not a problem to be solved, that my voice still mattered, that my home was mine, and that the right kind of love prepares for battle even when the enemy wears a wedding ring. If you're watching this, and something in your own life feels off, a relative who's suddenly too interested, a document you didn't authorize, a whisper campaign about your competence, listen. The time to fight is before the sign goes up. Document everything. Find your people. And never let anyone convince you that your story is over just because someone else wants to write the ending. Thank you for joining me in this story. If it moved you, share it. You never know who needs to hear that the dead can protect us, that a mother is never just an obstacle, and that the best chapters can begin at any age. Subscribe and be part of a community that knows our worth doesn't expire. Until next time, hold your home close and hold your truth closer.